On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, what if the Black Sea Grain Initiative stopped? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, back in July, the United Nations and Turkey brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine, which have been at war since February, to allow Ukraine to export grain as of July of 2022. That deal is set to expire on May 18th, and the question arises, what happens if that deal does expire? What are the implications for the world in terms of food coming out of Ukraine? What's the situation regarding Russia and Ukraine? A lot of variables out here. A lot of stories are coming out now about it, and I think a lot of the stories are really good, but they're also missing a couple of key points, and that's what I want to talk about today. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and delve into this topic. So this is a Reuters story over at GCAPT, and Ukraine says Russia has effectively stopped the Black Sea grain deal. And it goes on here, Ukrainian Black Sea ports were blockaded after Russia's invasion last year. I raised that issue about blockade. Russia has never declared the Ukrainian ports blockaded. They have basically put naval forces off the coast of it. This led to the sinking of the Moskva, for example. Ukraine has mined the waters to prevent the Russians from landing them. But there's never been a clear blockade ever announced on either side. There is just a war being waged, and that's what we see coming out from the IMO, from NATO, from the Maritime Administration. Everybody designates the northern half of the Gulf of Odessa as a war zone, and that's the way it's been for war risk insurance too. So anyway, Ukraine Black Sea ports were blockaded after Russia's invasion. The access to the three of them were cleared that July under a deal brokered between Moscow and Kyiv, which it's not true. It's between the UN and Turkey that really did this. But this is the statement right here. The Russian Federation once again effectively stopped the grain initiative by refusing to register incoming vessels and carry out their inspections. This approach contradicts the terms of the current agreement, and this is coming out of Ukraine. So let's look at the data here that is being provided. So this is from the UN site on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. They track all this information in detail. If you don't want to get this wonky about it, there's a great follow on Twitter at Exit266. Follow her. She's great. She takes all this data, puts in great tables and charts, and you can follow it right along. But the big thing to look at here is the amount of cargo that's been shipped out, about 29.8 million tons, 50% of it corn, 28% of it wheat, and the rest is other material, but it's all grain that's coming out. The other information is where it's going. And you'll see right here, China has gotten 7 million tons of it. Spain has gotten 5.4 million, Turkey 3 million, Italy 2 million, and the Netherlands 1.8 million. A lot of issues regarding this about the fact that this grain is not going to countries that need it. However, one of the things I would talk about is a country like Turkey, for example, will process a lot of that grain into flour and then distribute it around the world. But this chart shows you where all that Ukrainian grain is going. I highlighted the top 5, but it's going to lots of places: North Africa, East Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe. So it is going to a lot of places. So that grain is important. This is the chart that really breaks it down in more detail. And one of the things that is provided through the UN is this chart, is this table, Google Doc table, that gives you all the breakdowns. And what we see here is 940 ships since July have come out of Ukraine loaded with cargo, and you get all the data here for what is involved in this. This is a chart from a story we're going to be looking at here in a minute that gives you the number of vessels leaving Ukraine's deep sea ports each week. This goes back into August of 2022. Again, the deal started in July of 2022, but this is basically when you see the start. And you can see the huge kind of upswings here, the peaks. But one of the things you're noticing here is it is tapering off. It is coming down, this chart. There are fewer and fewer vessels coming out. And that coincides with the data on vessels being cleared to go in. This is the flip side of the data provided by the UN showing inbound vessels. And one of the things you'll notice here is just in May, just 10 vessels cleared so far coming in May. That is a slowdown, and this is what the Ukrainians are arguing, that the Russians are slowing down the inspections. There's a joint inspection center off Istanbul where Russians, Ukrainians inspect these vessels to make sure they're empty and clear. The Russians do not want ships coming into Ukraine with weapons and goods that can be used for warfare. Ironically, no one is stopping Russian cargo ships going into Russian ports with weapons and gear and everything, but this is part of that agreement. It's a very one-sided agreement against the Ukrainians. The Russians can flow whatever the hell they want, but the Ukrainians can't. But this is part of the deal because the Ukrainians are under attack by the Russians. This is marine traffic showing you the difference that we're talking about. So right here, that last ship I showed you on the chart is this one right here, the Maha Jacqueline, an Indian bulk carrier outbound from Odessa, heading to the Turkish inspection area just north of Istanbul. There's only a handful of ships here coming out. Lucky Glory, a Panamanian ship coming out, and then, as we mentioned before, the Maha Jacqueline coming out. So very few ships coming in and out of the region, which we know about. The other area I want to highlight here is the amount of traffic heading to Russia. Out of the Turkish Straits here, heading up along this chain, right here to the major ports, Novorossiysk, and up here to the Kerch Strait, which is just jam-packed with vessels waiting to clear the Kerch Strait. There's the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was the subject of attack last year. Here's the traffic north of the Kerch Strait, and then here's the traffic coming through the Sea of Azov. Vessels tend to turn off their AIS going through the Sea of Azov. And if you want to understand why the Russians invade Ukraine, it's this region right here. This entire north coast here, this is Mariupol, Berdansk, this is Crimea. This entire region here was controlled by Ukraine. And the Russians were petrified about the Ukrainians interdicting the flow of ships coming from the Kerch Strait up here to the port of Rostov. Why Rostov? Because when you zoom out here and you look at the interior of Russia, what you see here is a series of river systems that network together all of Russia. And this is not showing all the AIS, because Russian ships don't always show AIS, all the way over to the Caspian Sea. The Don River, into the Volga, into the Caspian, into the full river system that is Europe. And again, it all dumps out here into the Black Sea. And understand, this traffic is not being impeded by the Ukrainians. Russian ships are free-flowing. We know they're coming through the Turkish Straits. Now, you can't move military vessels through the Turkish Straits right now because Ukraine and Russia are belligerents, and under the Montreux Convention, Article, I believe it's 19, the Turks have been able to exclude the arrival of belligerent warships, but commercial ships can still come and go. And there's been a lot of vessels ID'd as Russian ships coming in, probably bringing military hardware coming into this region. Whereas the Russians have free flowing of cargo, the Ukrainians do not. And I think that is a big issue. I want to take you to this story by Greg Miller over at FreightWaves, an excellent story done by Greg. I highlight a lot of Greg's stories because I really like him. I think Greg does a fantastic job in detailing this, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things I think Greg omits. So what will happen if Russia blocks Black Sea grain ships? So as always, Greg gives you a great introduction. I'm going to gloss over that because I want to get to the main heart here. New threats not lifting commodity prices. So one of the big reasons to start the Black Sea Grain Initiative was a fear that global grain prices, particularly corn and wheat, would go through the roof. Because of the interdiction of Ukrainian grain, that was going to cause a uptick in prices. That has not happened. Matter of fact, what we've seen is commodity prices have not gone up by a huge amount. Therefore, those concerns have been basically alleviated. Whether the Ukrainian grain gets out or not doesn't seem to be impacting world grain prices. Jump over here. Russian wheat exports hitting record levels. This chart's a really interesting chart. I want to highlight a couple of things here. So this is the blue line. Light blue line shows you the 2020, 2021 levels here. The dark blue is 2021, 2022, and then the red is now 2022, 2023. And you see that the red is really exceeding the 5-year average. And there's this comment in here: the return of Ukrainian exports was not the main driver in the drop. Bumper wheat crops in Russia and Australia were the primary factor. Quote, Russia has been able to export at record levels and gain market share. Okay, I have to raise a question about this. Is this part of the Russian plan to basically dump a lot of wheat, a lot of grain onto the world market to basically offset the cost of Ukrainian wheat? Also, Russia needs the money. They need the money desperately. And between fuel and food, this is their big thing. Food and fuel are two of their big exports. The third is fertilizer, which we'll talk about. And Russia is dumping out. The other issue that should be asked right away is this Russian wheat or is this Ukrainian wheat that was grabbed and seized and brought back and now being sold? I think there's a lot of issues associated with that that needs to be looked at. So the worst case scenario for Ukrainian export. So a lot of issues are going on. One of the things we're seeing is issues about, again, this surge of grain coming out. So this worst case scenario is what would happen if you lose Ukrainian grain, particularly corn. And basically, everybody tends to think that this can be countered either through the US, Brazil, Argentina, their crops coming out. Now, we should note that there are issues, obviously, relying on fewer sources for food. We already saw in Brazil and Argentina last year, for example, droughts on the rivers there that really restricted the flow of grain out. We saw congestion in U.S. West Coast ports that didn't allow grain to come out. So again, relying on fewer and fewer sources does raise issues, which I think need to be done. The shipping effect on the Black Sea corridor. So one of the big things that we're seeing is the number of vessels that are coming out. And one of the big ones here is China has been the single largest destination for ships carrying Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea corridor. A total of 764 dry bulk vessels carrying 27.8 million tons of grain have departed Ukraine. These numbers are a little bit behind the chart I just showed you because it was up to date. Also, there are some vessels that carried multiple cargoes. So that's why you don't get the exact number of loads right there. And one of the things that we're seeing is where this grain is going. And again, we mentioned China getting 7 million tons of this grain. The other issue you have is the ban that was put in place by neighboring EU countries. So a lot of grain was also coming overland. It was coming by road and rail. Now, you can't move anywhere near the tonnage by road and rail that you can move by ship. But there were issues here that the other European countries were having a problem with this. And it was. We saw that in countries like Poland and Hungary that were not allowing any more Ukrainian grain to come in. And that's going to be alleviated in June. They're going to lift that ban and allow more Ukrainian grain in. But there is an issue with when the market prices do fall, do you want to be competing against this other grain coming out? And then finally, there's this myth on Russian fertilizer. There was this idea that concerns were that we were not going to be able to get fertilizer, and the fertilizer would have a big impact on the ability for crop production in the next year. Well, not only are we getting fertilizer, food, fuel, and fertilizer are coming out of Russia in record numbers, but the U.S. is buying more Russian fertilizer than ever before. So you got this weird issue here where we have a price cap on Russian diesel, Russian oil, but food and fertilizer are flowing without a problem. And you're seeing that in the market with tankers and bulkers right now, where we're seeing that issue come in. When you shut down the Odessa ammonia pipeline, for example, you lose all of a sudden all that ammonia coming out. Ammonia, a key component, obviously, in fertilizer, usually carry it in LPG tankers, liquefied petroleum gas tankers. And some companies have benefited from this. We see several companies that are basically Navigation Holdings, for example, which is increasing their voyages, their ton mile distances. But we also see fertilizer been coming out in dry bulk shipping in many ways. And so one of the things we're seeing is the fertilizer shortage that a lot of people were worried about did not materialize. It did not happen. And what we see is Russia is taking a bigger market share on this. But the issue I want to come back to that I don't think is raised in either Greg's story or in many of the stories I've seen is what is the long-term impact of this on Ukraine? Because everybody's sitting there going, hey, it's no problem. If the food slows down, it's not a problem. We're not going to have global famine, which was a big issue that was being talked about at the time. But this is going to be part of the economic warfare being waged by Russia against Ukraine. Grain is a key commodity for Ukraine. It is a bedrock of their economy. If they cannot produce grain and export grain and get it out. And if all of a sudden the southern Odessa, the southern Gulf of Odessa port shut down, that is going to cause a massive disruption. They were getting grain out through other ports down on the Danube, by rail out into neighboring countries. But as I mentioned to you before, some of these neighboring countries have put bans on some of that imports coming in. There's a finite amount you can get out through the Danube. Those ports are much smaller. And most importantly, this is exactly what Russia wants. They are fighting a total war against Ukraine. And the way you defeat Ukraine is if you can't defeat them militarily, you defeat them economically. You know, their Schlieffen plan to take Kiev didn't work. And instead, what they're doing is they're going into a long war. And understand, this is not new in history. So I always love to recommend two books. I'll give you two books right now. This book right here, Nick Lambert's The Warlords of the Gallipoli Disaster, How Globalized Trade Led Britain to the Worst Defeat of the First World War. Nick Lambert talks about the idea that what generated the Gallipoli campaign to open up the Dardanelles, the Turkish Straits, was a need to get at Russian grain to feed the rest of the world during the First World War. That was offset by record yields of grain coming out of the U.S. and Australia. And ironically, a new book talks about U.S. exports, how American wheat remade the world. This is Scott Nelson's Oceans of Grain, talking about how important food is for distribution around the world. This is a topic that is of great concern. If the Black Sea Grain Initiative is not renewed, if Russia is able to shut off the trade coming out of Ukraine, then this is going to have an impact on global food. Yes, your food prices are not going to spike. We're going to shift where we're getting food from, but this could basically pull the rug out from the Ukrainians. It also raises the issue is if the Russia is not backing this deal, why not just keep going to Ukraine? Ships can still go to Ukraine if they want to. The question becomes the war risk insurance. Is it a higher premium to sail that distance? Because now the Russians haven't agreed not to attack them. And we know the Russians have attacked commercial ships during this war. So you raise the issue. Nothing is stopping ships from sailing to Ukraine. There's no one helping them. The NATO's not there. No one's providing escort or provisions for that. Something that NATO could do is provide escorts, either ships, air, whatever, to make sure those vessels come and go. The other potential is that Ukrainians sit there and say, well, if you're not going to let our ships in, we're going to stop your ships going in. And they start targeting Russian ships coming out of the Kerch Straits, coming out of Novorossiysk. And now all of a sudden you have the tanker war part 2.0, with the Black Sea being like the Persian Gulf of the 1980s. So a lot of potential here for this to blow back in our face. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon. You'll see a link come up here at the end of the video or down in the show notes. Till our next video, this is Sal, signing off.